Okay, so I just read a really interesting book. It's called Against Empathy: The Case for Rational Compassion, and it's by Paul Bloom, who's a psychologist. And I saw this and I was interested in reading it because it was recommended for those that were interested in the last book that I read by Jonathan Haidt. So, along the lines of moral psychology and things of that nature. And as I read kind of the summary, it seemed like it was touching on similar things. How is it that we make moral decisions in society, particularly as it relates to our political decisions and propensities? And so I thought, it probably would be somewhat supplementary to that information. And it definitely is very, very similar to Jonathan Haidt's text, The Righteous Mind. I would give this book, Against Empathy, maybe a 6 or 7, maybe 6.5 to 7. It's precisely as it's advertised. So his argument throughout this text is that we should not think of empathy or use it as much as a lot of people suggest or promote that we should be using empathy. And Paul Bloom argues, that empathy really is, on balance, more harmful than it is helpful. Now, some of the reasons for my rating would be, for one, it wasn't quite as informative in terms of the psychological science or the evolutionary psychology and cognitive science as the other recent book that I've read. He did describe some helpful information, some helpful research and findings. And so, this is somewhat compelling. The idea of it, though, I think a lot of people would be, really hesitant to even read it. And I was too, as once I started it, I was really trying to just sort of stretch myself and not make too quick of a judgment about it before moving into it and continuing to read it. What we have to understand about this idea is the idea of empathy is somewhat differentiated from things like compassion and kindness and care. And he talks about this very specifically in the text. And this is part of why the book, I would give it, a lower rating than recent texts, because at the end of the day, you can read this and you can come to the conclusion, okay, this is basically in some sense, it's a semantics argument, because it's not going to convince people to stop wanting to be like that thing that we call empathy. Rather, it's just kind of a convincing argument that we can just use a different term. And the term that he uses in this text is compassion. And this isn't just semantics. Actually, he does describe how we can measure in our brains through neuroscience how compassion and kindness and empathy are actually different things. So our brain responds and reacts in different ways with these different ideas. So that's kind of the core of it. When he argues against empathy, he's not really arguing against that thing that we all want when we seek empathy or when we promote empathy. He's arguing against a very nuanced idea within this realm of these good things. But Bloom definitely is fully for compassion and kindness and things like this. Now, what's that difference, you might ask? So very basically, the difference that he says between compassion and empathy is that compassion is when you feel a certain way for something that another person is going through. They're having an experience and you respond to it with a particular feeling. Whereas empathy specifically is mirroring that feeling. And not only do you feel for them, you feel the same feelings that they are feeling in that moment. You're experiencing the same thing that they are experiencing in whatever is happening. Now, it might be hard to imagine that that's a bad thing, but he does actually give some, very helpful evidence as to why empathy and this particular understanding of empathy can be unhelpful or even harmful. And that's his general argument, is that letting this feeling of empathy kind of guide our moral decisions can actually be bad. It can actually lead to negative outcomes. And I think this is based on, what he provides, what information he provides. This is a reasonable conclusion. But he himself also says that, and this is kind of a spoiler even to the end of the book, empathy in and of itself is not a bad thing in certain ways. It can be used as a tool, and it can be helpful sometimes. It is when we use it as kind of that guider, the thing that is guiding us to make decisions and choose what actions to take. That's when it can become problematic, and that's when there are ways that we can actually see how that is harmful in society. And so those are kind of the two ways that the book, the title of it is somewhat of a clickbait. It's the fact that it's empathy that's defined somewhat differently than it's generally used in our culture, in society. Although he does discuss that specifically, he does say, even though we talk about empathy and maybe we're thinking of different things depending on who's using it and in what context, ultimately, whenever we talk about empathy, we are talking about this way of kind of feeling what others are feeling. And so he does address that. But also, there is the matter of the idea of compassion and kindness and care. Those are still really important, and those would still be considered morally good, regardless of your position on empathy proper. And then the other thing is simply that it's not 100% bad. It can be helpful. There are reasons why it is helpful for us, and we can use it as a tool in some ways. It just shouldn't be the overarching, overpowering moral guide. And he does address this as well. He does talk about how there are clearly ways that empathy is useful, but it's just a matter of making sure that it doesn't, it's not the reason that we do what we do, or, the only factor or the superior factor in any of our moral decisions. Now, one of the interesting factors about this, and he does have a section in the book where he talks about this, is the politics of it and how empathy kind of fits into our sort of modern Western politics of left versus right, specifically liberal and conservative ideologies. And again, these are broad generalizations. He talks about that too, but by and large, we kind of put political ideas into these two camps. And as you would expect, the liberal camp is a lot more empathetic, or at least a bit more empathetic, but kind of going back to Jonathan Haidt's work, which Bloom references here, is there's not just the empathy that's being utilized in our mental moral processes or decision making with conservatives especially. So conservatives utilize a broader range of kind of moral frameworks, or they have a broader moral framework with different dimensions. And typically, liberals only have a couple of dimensions. And so I've talked more about that in the text about Jonathan Haidt's work. But this raises a very interesting question, which is, how do we then kind of go along in making our everyday ethical decisions, or even just on the bigger scale of political action? How do we make these ethical decisions and make policies based on them? Because yes, he says in this text that we should not base that all in empathy, because there are ways that that becomes problematic. But what he generally basically is arguing for, and as it seems to me, is a utilitarian approach, right? Rationally thinking through what is best and applying that over just your emotional response to something or somebody. And he does talk in the book about kind of the conflict between these two ways of approaching our ethical decisions. But basically, I would say that's the trick, is figuring out, can we live in this sort of utilitarian way of going about making decisions, or do we need empathy, and how do they work together?